Hello, thank you all so much for coming to our session this morning. We're really excited. I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself first. My name is Ellie Jin, and I'm a licensed psychologist at the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in behavioral health.
My name is Amy Tao-Foster. I'm a licensed professional counselor specialist at the Counseling and Mental Health Center.
And today, the two of us will be presenting our experiences establishing and maintaining support groups for minority students within university counseling centers. So first and foremost, Amy and I are incredibly honored to be here with you all today, and we want to thank the many people that made this conference possible, including the Minority Mental Health Awareness Summit organizers, the creators of No More Martyrs, especially Dr. Nadia Richardson, the many conference and CE sponsors who made it possible for us to provide credit for our session, the participants who are in this room with us, the various speakers who we're learning so much from, and ultimately our clients as well, who provided their vulnerability in shared stories and help create the spaces that we'll be expanding on today.
Hello.
And we also want to certify that we have no conflict of interest for the topics that we'll be discussing today.
All right. Can everyone hear me now? Yes. Okay, so we're going to be going over the learning objectives for us today. If you're comfortable, I know you're putting your name in the chat, but if you could also share your role, for example, if you're a mental health practitioner, an advocate, a researcher, a community activist, higher education staff, etc. But so our learning objectives are today. So we'll be learning about creative strategies to increase accessibility of mental health and support for historically marginalized students. We'll be discussing examples of collaborative and mutually beneficial relationships with campus partners, and we'll be exploring ways to effectively support students whose identities differ from ourselves as group facilitators.
So I want to start off by defining the challenge that many of us are facing as mental health providers, namely both the recognition of the significant need for services among our minority students and also the numerous barriers that we are experiencing in reaching our target population. So from research, we know that minority students who hold one or more non-dominant identities, including, for example, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, are at increased risk for negative mental health outcomes. And societal discrimination and systemic barriers makes it especially difficult for folks to access care. Healthcare settings have historically been really hostile towards racial minorities and gender expensive individuals. And so when we examine national data, minority students who utilize mental health services are found to be significantly lower compared to their majority counterparts. They're really not accessing the care that is available. And when we look at both research and also anecdotal evidence, we also recognize the various cultural stigmas related to mental health services. I know that Amy and I have talked about both having encountered students who were very hesitant to seek services despite a lot of symptom severity because they grew up with the notion that mental health services should be endured with secrecy and shame. And relatedly, when minority students are finally able to access services after waiting for a long time, after battling their own internalized stigma, they find a really deep disconnect between their personal cultural belief systems and the therapist sitting across from them. So for example, a therapist that pathologizes a client's religious beliefs, or a client that, or asking a client to advocate or confront their parents about a specific thing without understanding, for example, the interdependent culture that the client is situated in. These are experiences of microaggressions in therapy that ultimately lead to minority students terminating treatment a lot earlier than their peers. And finally, there's a growing body of evidence that really indicate lack of cultural competency in providing care is really detrimental to report and ongoing support for that individual.
All right, so Ellie mentioned in the literature around historically marginalized folks, including lower utilization rates and attrition in therapy and cultural stigma around mental health services. Strategies that we've utilized include creating more, quote, low-key events that are indirectly related to mental health, such as community discussions around family, dating, normalizing emotions. There are stories about folks who are so anxious about counseling that they ride out to the elevator to the 5th floor of our building where our counseling center is, and immediately ride back down without stepping foot on the 5th floor. So we want to be able to meet the needs of our students where they're at already, and to make it less anxiety provoking. So making sure to, we're talking about reducing barriers. So the main goal of our groups really is to build community for our clients. And if we make discussion groups more casual and less structures, folks who are hesitant around counseling will feel more open to engaging in connection and conversation with each other. I also utilize an email newsletter that plays as a low risk, low key intervention for students to engage in without having to join the group, but with information each week about joining if they want to. We include mental health wellness tips and articles about friendships and relationships and pop culture, identity affirming content, and memes and community events. I've been told that students choose to read the newsletter instead of hopping onto Instagram for FOMO or Twitter to doom scroll. And that's helpful to me because it takes a long time to do the newsletter. And sometimes I think like, no one is reading this. This is taking me an hour, but it's been actually very helpful. Like I've had students say, oh, I've read the newsletter for like 2 semesters and I'm decided to join. And then we also, want to make it low risk by reducing, including it being drop-in based. So folks can come and go depending on what their availability is, since students have various time commitments outside of academics, including work, student orgs, and family obligations. We also reduce stigma by not doing notes. And that's helpful. That's really helpful for students to increase access.
Just to say, the newsletter has become a cultural phenomenon on campus, and definitely big kudos to Amy for creating that. So thank you. Yep.
So the group that I run is called Asian Voices at UT, and it's held on campus away from the counseling center. And we collaborate with the Center for Asian American Studies. And so if you look at this graphic, this is from an Instagram post, and I blocked out, names, but, they share the events and, post when we're having them. And it's really a great way to connect with the community and meet students where they're at. And it's probably my favorite group that I do at CVC because of the nature of it. And being at COS, I really feel like it also increases a sense of community for our Asian students who don't really have like a place on campus. So we've tried to make that so at COS.
So one way that Amy and I have worked to reach out to minority students, she shared an example earlier, is collaborating with non-clinical campus staff members. And so for me, this include working with directors of the Asian American Culture Center when I was working at Colorado State University previously, and also more recently, the director of the Gender and Sexuality Center at University of Texas, Austin. And in these situations, I established support groups for Asian students, and then also in the second case, established group for gender expensive folks.
And in our roles, in my role, we create joint programming with community partners. And this has like several positive aspects, including expanding the community and resources for students outside of UT Austin and to folks in the Austin area. They can connect for networking, mentorship support, cultural events, and yeah, just a widening of their community and people that they can connect to and relate to outside of UT, which is, it's a predominantly white institution. And so, I'll share some examples of some flyers that I've done, but we've had several events with community partners and UT campus partners, including how to deal with COVID-related racism, bystander interventions, and we held a town hall following the murders in Atlanta this year.
One thing that I created when I was working at Colorado State University was Story Circle, a group for Asian students there. I first developed the idea for this community support group for Asian students because I was hearing many reports of microaggressions and isolation in my individual sessions as a clinician, and also just recognizing there was a lack of defined collective space for folks to process these experiences in a therapeutic setting. And so I reached out to the Asian Pacific American Culture Center on campus to really better understand the larger campus climate within the city. And for Collins, Colorado, where CSU is situated, is 88% white and only 3.5% Asian. And I was remembering my own experiences of how difficult it was to establish a sense of community when I moved there for training and saw very few people around me look like me. And the closest Asian grocery store was 1.5 hours away in Denver. It was rough, yeah. And having to make that trek every couple of weeks was honestly just really frustrating and made me feel very isolated in a place that didn't feel like home yet. So I advocated to my leadership within the University Counseling Center where I was working at the time and did a lot of education on the benefits of a non-traditional support group without clinical notes and attendance. And that was honestly really mind-blowing for them. But I continued to advocate and ultimately establish Story Circle, which is a group, a drop-in space for Asian students. During the planning process for this group, I was really thoughtful about inviting a non-clinical staff member, my colleague at the time, Vani Narayana, to join me as a co-leader because I was able to facilitate the group only once a week, and she was able to have contact with the students throughout the week for continuity. And so that was something that felt really important to me. Also, as a Chinese American woman, I recognized that I only represented a small fraction of the Asian American identity. And so it was important also for that reason for her to be there. And as the group kind of started and went on, it was really clear that it addressed a big gap on campus because it was consistently really well attended with only really word of mouth advertising. Students, came in, they learned about group and they found community and they shared with their friends. In the context of the group, students talked about their experiences of immigration, biracial identity, internalized racism, trauma, transracial adoption, their relationship with their parents, body image, identity exploration when it comes to gender, sexuality, and so many other topics. I was, unlike a more traditional therapy group, I was really intentional about self-disclosures as a way of modeling what that could look like in a mental health setting. And together, we cried, we laughed, and we shared snacks and tea together, which is also not stereotypical of a traditional therapy group, because that's what the space and the students needed, which was a sense of community.
So I wanted to go over some creative offerings and support. So a priority of mine is to make the group or community inclusive, sort of like a for us, by us mentality, so that it's engaging. To be inclusive to me means to invite someone and have their favorites there, and it helps students feel welcome and seen. we really asked students what they would like to see, and in our discussions, and we had a panel around dating while Asian, because these conversations came up so much in the group. So that's really important. And then I just, wanted to name that culture. We were talking about food, culturally relevant snacks. Like I had students share that going from their hometown to a PWI, there was a hard adjustment, and that was access to food they enjoy. One student shared that they had a hard time adjusting to how bland dorm food was compared to how spicy, flavorful her mother's cooking was. She was Daisy. Having snacks such as shrimp chips or lychee jelly can be refreshing after meetings filled with pizza and granola bars. And then I also wanted to create interactive ways to connect, that students can connect, such as like using Google Docs and Jamboards to help establish community, which has been helpful during the pandemic and remote learning environments. And that's also just how students connect in general, is online. And so here is some, examples of different outreaches that I've done, and flyers. And so there's the Dating While Asian. This was really fun, the Fun Ramen pop-up. What is more, connecting and community than sharing food, especially like, if you're Asian, like hot noodle soup. And that was, that wasn't related to mental health at all, but obviously it was like a great intervention to get people to connect. And then this collective conversation from Yellow Peril to, from model minority to Yellow Peril. Like this was a community event online, right after the pandemic started, and we had a collective conversation around racism and COVID and Asian identity. So these are examples of kind of creative things that we've done, including collaborating, utilizing community members to collaborate.
Yeah, and fun fact, at the time when Amy held this event back in April, I was working in the community as a private practice clinician. And through, we didn't actually know each other at the time, but through a series of connections, I was brought on as a panelist for this event. And probably not a coincidence that shortly after, I applied to a position at the university, and now we get to be colleagues all the time, which is such a joy for me. So that was a really cool outreach that ultimately, led to my career at the university as well.
Here is an example of an experiential group art activity that we did around intergenerational trauma. And so, basically it's like talking about our roots and values and strengths, and what we want to keep and what we want to leave behind. And, this was a fun group, art activity that, was related to mental health and family, but wasn't part of a traditional therapy group. It was part of an event, and students really enjoyed it.
I was really impressed by all the different ways that Amy has, really pulled in creativity to reach students. So thank you. So part of this, in collaborating with community at large, one of the things that really motivated this was hearing my students' negative experiences with therapists that lacked cultural competency. And so, more than once, someone was referred to me after they maybe had a negative experience with a previous provider. And for me, this motivated an educational series for the clinicians within my university counseling center. Amy and I worked really closely to bring together Asian identified community therapists and staff member from the Center for Asian American Studies to educate our staff and provide culturally grounded clinical framework for better case conceptualization and treatment.
And also it helped, introduce these folks to our staff so that we could refer to them and connect student with services. Because there is, we have a small, Asian community and a therapist of color community in Austin, but it is very predominantly white, and it is can be challenging to find a culturally grounded therapist in Austin. And like I said, connecting with the community at large is just great for my own mental health, but also to just expand Asian students' sense of community. And right after, there's a slide, there's a flyer here on this slide about the town hall we had after Atlanta murders, and we connected with like so many Austin agencies, including the Asian American Resource Center, the mayor's office, student groups, the staff association, ADPAC, which is a student organization, the community health initiatives in the city of Austin. And, because of that, we got to connect and meet community needs. And also, our university staff and students were more aware of like this presence and these supportive spaces where they may not have been before.
Amy is saying we, and I just want to say that she really single-handedly created this event while navigating her own grief and loss and pain and trauma after the Atlanta murders this past year. And she was able to reach out to so many people that we had attendees from all over Texas, even beyond the state. And it was really incredible. She really created a space for people when there was just a lot of suffering at the time. And so it was wonderful. It was really, really well received. And in addition to that, she's also been really attentive to the retention of staff members. And the one way that she's created that was establish informal networks. So I onboarded as an employee during the pandemic, and without being able to see my colleagues in person, it was really difficult. And one thing that Amy did that has been such a saving grace for me was she created a Teams chat that's accessible on our work computers called Millennium Menagerie. And on it, she really joined various staff members, that are racial minorities or biracial, and really had us all come together so that we can support each other, process experiences of microaggressions, and just really validate and support each other in that space. And I think that's created a world of difference. We've since, branched beyond that to have more in-person, experiences, but she was really the one that created that space for us at the beginning.
Thanks. And we tell, our students of color that we work with that having spaces in contexts like that to go to after experiencing racism or microaggressions is super important. It's validating because there's so many ways that folks of color have been gaslighted around these experiences. So having a connection, a reality check is really important and affirming.
Yeah. And so, as we're talking about supporting our students, one thing that we want to emphasize as well is the need and the importance of supporting staff and the people who are creating these spaces as well.
So, some challenges for these identity-based groups include like a need for representation. So as an Asian American, Asian American identity is not a monolith. Like there's so many variations and diversity within, what is called Asian. And I hold, I'm a Southeast Asian second generation person. And so there's, there's life experiences that I won't get compared to someone who is like a first generation who immigrated when they were adults. And then of course, I'm also like a cisgendered hetero, person. And so like that, my identity can't match up with everyone else's identities in the group. So it's really important. It was been really important for me to be aware of that. One semester for Asian Voices, it was all DESI students. It was all South Asian students. And I spent a long time like not asking students to explain aspects of the culture, but just looking stuff up online. And, you know, just listening and learning a lot around South Asian identity and just really the importance of representation, because East Asians are often represented as far as like Asian identity, and the importance of making sure to be inclusive of all Asian identities. That has been important and has been a challenge to learn from.
And for me, you know, how this showed up was in January of this year, our only trans-identified clinician departed from our agency. And while the center really scrambled to transfer his clients, there was a lot of ongoing discussion about who would continue to lead a long-established therapy group that he's created for trans students. And in light of various transphobic legislative bills in the country, it felt really important to make sure that the group lived on. And based on student feedback, leadership approached me, a cis woman, to lead the space. As a new employee at the time, I, you know, was battling my own internal experience in response to this ask. And I consulted with a lot of colleagues, both within and outside of the agency, about what it means for me to be in the space as a cis woman, balancing, you know, the need for the space to live on while also consistently advocating to leadership to hire more gender expansive clinicians. Ultimately, you know, representation matters for many reasons in terms of safety and community. Like Amy was saying, it is incredibly emotionally taxing to show up to a therapeutic space and to be expected to explain and educate the facilitator. That's not, you know, the environment or the experience that we want to create for students. So speaking more about trans and non-binary voices at UT that I developed in the past year, I'm currently on my second semester running this space. And as a cis woman, it was important for facilitation to be co-created with someone who identified as being part of the trans non-binary community. And so this opened up a neat opportunity for collaboration with the Gender and Sexuality Center on campus at UT Austin. And along with Assistant Director of the Gender and Sexuality Center, Gwyn Han, we co-created a space that was intentionally irreverent and free from traditional confines of therapy. And this is intentional so that we can help to reduce the barriers for access for students. And so we began each group with members checking in about highs and lows of the week. And in this case, we used kitties and shitties, and ended the group every week with Today I Heard. So members can more deeply resonate with each other and what they learn from each other from the space. A really interesting experience for me was coming out as a cis woman in group, which is something I've not had to do in other spaces as someone who held a dominant identity. And so as I worked on my own experience of imposter syndrome, being in the space with gender expansive folks, and I really continue to advocate to my agency about the need to hire more trans-identified clinicians, I was really, really heartened to learn through anonymous feedback that the group that we created for our students, you know, was what they needed. So here's a quote from one of our members who has given us permission to share today. So they said, "This group provided a very safe space and an immense feeling of acceptance that I have never received or thought was possible. I am now aware that there are people out there, even strangers, that can help you feel more at ease simply by actively listening to what you have to say." And so this was just a really lovely moment after, you know, reviewing the feedback at the end of the semester.
So this is a continuation of why representation matters. And so I'm going to do a TLDR. White therapists who utilize colorblind perspectives can fail their clients by not seeing important aspects of their lives related to their identities. And so this is a quote that I found from a white therapist. Not being Asian American, one thing to keep in mind, however, is that there are certain aspects of counseling and therapy that are important to success, regardless of who is delivering the service. In most cases, it doesn't matter so much, long as their therapist has learned it well and has confidence in it. There may be a preferred cultural specific style for therapy with Asian American clients, but psychotherapy research in general would suggest that techniques used by the most successful therapists in any setting have more in common than they have differences.
Also, I'm a huge fan of Trevor Noah. And in that slide on the right, for those who don't know, he is meeting with Tommy Lauren. I would say a political pundit.
I don't have nice things to say about her.
Yeah.
But this is my gift reaction to the quote and to therapists that I've worked with, and both as clients and colleagues, talking about, well, we're more in common than we're different.
And I think the piece there is that by ignoring those differences, we're really causing harm.
So next, we're just going to take a few minutes to do an experiential activity, since a lot of our groups have experiential activities. So I want you to think about, choose an aspect of your identity, and it can be racial, ethnicity, generational, gender, personality, job, any aspect of your identity. And then come with an example that using the template below. Tell us your blank without telling us your blank. And then in the chat, you can share your answer.
And Amy and I will try to do that as well, so that we can do a little bit of modeling.
And so, you know, one thing like is like, I'm Asian, right? If you wear shoes in my house, I will yell at you.
For me, it would be like saving a random collection of takeout containers to be used for food storage later. And so I have a collection of Greek yogurt containers, as well as various takeout containers from restaurants, and reusing them. So that's how my cultural identity as an immigrant and also as an Asian identified person shows up for me. What about you? I'm going to type my response in the chat.
And I can confirm Ellie's example. I've seen her drink water out of little yogurt glass cups.
I do that. They're so cute. They're little jars.
Tell me your sister without telling me your sister. Hair products. Ooh, when I'm looking for my bonnet. Looking for a bonnet.
Yeah, keep them coming. These are great. And for some people, this might be taking a moment to pause and really thinking about it, because we're not often asked to reflect on our identities in this specific way. Yep. Looks like we have some other people that are also anti-shoes in the house.
I'm in my office, today, and I have boba straws and chopsticks.
That's awesome. Well, thank you all for participating in that experience, and encourage you to continue to reflect on it and think about, the various aspects of your identity.
So, we want to, I want to do, part of the group is to have like experiential connections. And so making the space relatable includes meeting clients where they're at. And our clients are college age, either young millennials or Generation Z. And we connect with them, at their level. And so we talk about pop culture, internet culture, memes, things shared on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok. Kyle, I love that. Sorry, I'm distracted. And so like that, tell me your blank without telling me your blank. I feel like that was on Twitter. And so, yeah, like we want to make it relatable and connectable. And so I also, part of the group is asking and giving recommendations for media, shows, music, podcasts, or books. And and just asking and providing suggestions for food, especially, is like a huge thing. But wellness practices, ways to manage communication or conversation with family members. Yeah, so these are all ways that we have experiential connections in these groups.
And while I'm not as cool as Amy, one thing that I found students really resonate with is just learning more about resources or media that represent them. It can feel really tough, to see stories on TV and other in movies where the main characters don't look like you, and if anything, you're a minor side character for whatever reason. And so it can feel really validating to learn more about resources. And again, this is another point in terms of increasing representation. So throughout our experience running various groups and in our efforts to reach students with marginalized identities, we learned a lot of, kind of takeaways, a lot of wisdom that we hope to share with y'all today. And we're summarizing them in this slide. One thing that we recognize in our groups is that there are very different levels of awareness of social justice issues, race, and identity development. And so, it's really very much about meeting students where they are. And one thing that I realized, for example, when I was running Story Circle was, some students, for example, had a hard time, really recognizing their own internalized racism, for example, and it's about kind of being gentle and taking it slow and, providing some education, although not pushing them so that they, become radicalized, so to speak. And something else I learned more recently in my trans nonbinary group was that, there are some folks who are in very early stages of coming out, identifying as gender expansive. And so what that looks like is, for example, them showing up to the Zoom drop-in group with their cameras off and, just and really kind of just sitting and listening and not participating. While that might seem, strange in a more traditional therapy group, it's what they're needing at the time, just to be in community with other people and not necessarily be in a space where they could have a lot of disclosure.
Oftentimes, these types of groups are our students' first contact with mental health. And so to be, very aware and mindful of it. There can be a level of comfort in connecting with me as a group facilitator. And, I make it as, as easy as possible to be connected with me for counseling through my role. But sometimes like I am not available. And so there's, importance of like connecting with community therapists or, finding trusted, accomplices or culturally grounded folks who can, treat them in a culturally relevant way. It also takes time to build community connection and just to build the community. When I first started the Voices group many years ago, sometimes I would just have like two students or three students, and I had to be really intentional about community building. And now even in the virtual space, I have like 13 students come, and they come every week, and it is surprising, but in a positive way.
Yeah, we also learned that, as we're reaching out to community members to build connection, that it takes a lot of time to make those connections happen. And, what that means is having additional time for consultation, and then even more time afterwards when those relationships are forged. And so it's an ongoing process of building trust with somebody else that's not within your agency, or maybe even within your agency. And so making sure that you're allocating for that time is really important for that ongoing relationship to be successful.
So, there's challenges in handling crises and having to, set expectations for the student. So like, let's say they're in distress, like how do we de-escalate and help them, but also turn the attention back to the group. And so it's been a challenge to learn how to manage that. We also want to be identity affirming and protecting of the space. A lot of times, like students will have an assignment to, I don't know, for some cultural competency, and they want to observe the group, and I have to send them away because that's not the point of it. And a big pet peeve of mine is the School of Social Work here sending students, social work students, to observe groups when they should know better. But yeah, and then there are people who want to, observe, or like Zoom bomb. I had a student who made a fake EID, and it was suspicious, and I went and looked them up, and it turned out that they were a white student and they wanted to join the group, and I just didn't I didn't trust it. And so we had to work with our tech folks to, kind of confirm and screen EIDs. And then it's also important to obtain feedback from clients so that they can co-create the space. Like anybody in mental health, like group is so helpful because like it's like a peer support, and working with young folks and late adolescents, like a lot of times they will be able to resonate more with someone their age, and someone their age like telling them like their experiences versus like an authority figure. So that's really important too, so they can co-create the space.
Definitely, it's a different thing to hear your therapist give you feedback and say, your interpersonal style is X, or this is how you show up in our relationship. It's very different to hear that from a peer who can really tell you straight up, like what you said here, was strange, or this, didn't sit well with me, or have you thought about this other perspective? It definitely has a much direct impact. The other thing that felt really important as our ongoing, as our groups, continued, was really to always solicit feedback from clients, through anonymous surveys and so on, to learn more about how they're actually experiencing the space, and using that information to make changes and adjustments. And in terms of thinking about what events to hold in the future, this is really demonstrating to them that these are spaces created for you, and you have the power to make it into what you're needing. Really loving all of the tell us your blank without saying your blank. These are some really, really awesome examples. Ooh. And we also have time reserved at the very end for Q&A. So I do see your question in there, Tiffany, and we'll go to that in a moment. I think we can all resonate with the experience of having a biscuit tin that's just a sewing kit. I know that was my experience growing up. And maybe even be pleasantly surprised when there were cookies found inside. The one time that happened for me. So we had some questions that we wanted to pose to our audience, just to get folks to think a little bit more about the examples that we shared, and some of the reflection that we had. Some of the questions include, like, what are some of the ways that you or your agency has tried to reach out to folks with non-dominant identities? So whether you're in a university setting or private practice, or some other way, what are some of the ways that you've responded to folks with non-dominant identities? And through those experiences, what has been helpful, and maybe what are some of the barriers that you've encountered? We'd also just love to hear about any hopes that you have for groups in the future. So we invite you to just drop in your, reflections or thoughts in chat so that we can share those out loud. Folks, a little bit of time to reflect on some of these questions. So Denise has shared that they try to be culturally competent and also recognizing that there's a lot to learn. And I think any therapist worth their salt would say the same thing, right? That they have a lot to offer, and then it's an ongoing learning process when it comes to cultural competency issues related to diversity. And part of that, is being intentional when stepping into some of these spaces to not have clients explain themselves, while they're trying to seek therapeutic support. And so a part of the experience is doing, like Amy was saying, doing a lot of research and Googling right between sessions to learn more about what it means, for example, to support a client whose identity does not match theirs.
And it can also be like watching films, like going to like a queer film festival or Asian American film festival, or Latinx film festival, like looking at media sources, looking at shows, going to blogs. Like there are lots of ways that you can, you can gain cultural competence and exposure.
Definitely, it's not all, reading a dense textbook with lots of citations, but rather experientially learn yourself too, what it's like to maybe be your client's shoes for a moment. One thing that I had alluded to, we have another comment. Tiffany has said language has been the biggest barrier, and definitely that's a big part of it, right? Oftentimes, like when serving folks with non-dominant identities, language is something else that we have to consider. And so reaching people with different language capabilities, or just, potentially having English as their second language can be challenging. That's not something that we've addressed in the presentation. So really appreciate you, Tiffany, for bringing that up. I was going to share that, one barrier that I've encountered through different group experiences is really kind of advocating and challenging what traditional therapy looks like, both in terms of like perfectionism, which I think, a lot of the pieces are really rooted in white supremacy, in terms of like, how we conduct group, or what topics we talk about, or the level of casualness or irreverence that we can include. And also, the need for tracking people and for documenting what was discussed. For many folks, this feels like really restrictive and doesn't feel safe because they're still trying to figure out, whether a therapeutic environment is okay for them, and to have to consistently attend group when they're balancing jobs and other things doesn't feel like it will work for them. And so it kind of creates an all or nothing thinking for clients, where they're thinking like, well, if I am forced to, the only way I can get help is I have to attend every day for a certain period of time, then maybe this group is not for me. And so we're ruling out people that will really benefit from group already at the beginning. And furthermore, I have a lot of students for a variety of reasons being really concerned about documentation, right? So I have students who, are immigrants, for example, that have been concerned about their mental health status being somehow shared with, USCIS, and that impacting their future both in the United States as well as their home country. We also have students that are just maybe in the process of coming out and don't necessarily want that documented in their medical health record, that they're attending a group for, for trans non-binary students. And I saw a hand raise. And it disappeared. Did you catch that, Amy?
Let's see.
Oh, yes. You guys, Witherspoon? Looks like you have a question. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. Please correct me. Feel free to put your question in the chat as well, or unmute yourself if possible.
And then after that, I wanted to address Tiffanys comment too.
Yeah.
Let's look, and then Hope.
Mm-hmm.
Just put in chat.
Yeah, go ahead and put your question in chat.
So while they're doing that, I just wanted to address Tiffanys comment, which is absolutely real. This dominant society tries to divide minorities. There's like a concept of racial triangulation between Blacks and Asians. And it's very purposeful, right?
Mm-hmm.
To divide us is to make us weaker against white supremacy. I mean, this was a couple of years ago, and thank goodness he's gone out of office now, but Trump, when he was talking about immigration and the wall, he was talking about how Latinx immigrants were taking jobs away from Black folks. But there is absolutely this racial triangulation. And the model minority myth is actually based on trying to pit Asians against other minorities, and I think more specifically Black and African-American folks. Look at this, they're minority and they can handle it, so they're doing well. And so it's not white supremacy or systemic issues why other minorities aren't doing well. There's a really good book called Minor Feelings that talks about the LA riots, and specifically the interactions between the Koreans and the Black and African Americans in LA during that time. But I could give a whole thing about that. And there's a lot in the younger generation about Asian and Black solidarity, and that's a big interest at UT. So it is very, very intentional that dominant society tries to divide us and to pit us against each other.
And then addressing Tiffany's question in the QA, thank you for the question. How can I, as a minority clinician, be more helpful to other minorities different from me? I'm going to try to start answering that question. I would love your input as well, Amy. I think the first thing is just to acknowledge the history of white supremacy within the context, and how historically, because minorities have been pitted against each other, it's been really difficult to be supportive of each other, because it kind of felt like a great sense of scarcity, right? If I'm able to acknowledge my privilege or have a gain in some way, then it means that somebody else doesn't. It just feels like so few opportunities. How many times, an example of that was, how many times have you watch a TV show, I notice that, well, okay, if it's an all-white cast, there's a single other person that, you know, has some sort of racial ethnic identity that's different, but there's only one of them, right? And so one way to just start is, in my opinion, just to address the historical context and have that be a starting point.
I think also is to look at your positionality, right? And so with my Asian American identity, I have this, well, there's an adjacency or wished adjacency within some folks to whiteness. And so to identify positionality, like we experience oppression, but then there's also like some privilege that, you know, it comes with being Asian. And yeah, to acknowledge your own privileges, I think, and how that compares to other folks, like is, you know, like is important. And to acknowledge the differences too.
We're learning that there might be some challenges in participants, attendees unmuting themselves and speaking. And so definitely encourage you all to put a question in the Q&A if there's something that you'd like for us to discuss specifically. So we did also want to share some resources with folks. So these are just citations that you know, we've kind of identified during the research of this presentation that Amy has kindly put together. And with last couple minutes left, we wanted to just open up to everyone, you know, for your questions, reactions, and thoughts. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for that feedback and for participating in our panel. In closing, just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, what we presented today is just a few examples of what it means to creatively reach out to students with minority identities. And we're also learning as part of that too. Our clients are teaching us so much every single day about what it means to create spaces for them. And for that, we're so incredibly grateful. And the other thing that feels important to acknowledge is, you know, as clinicians with marginalized identities as well, it feels like a lot of our job is challenging what traditional therapy or honestly things rooted in white supremacy. And so that's been an ongoing part of our work so that we can provide adequate care for our students.